Okay, welcome. And we are going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourself in the chat. Project Unicorn is really excited to be collaborating with our colleagues at Digital Promise today and some fabulous school leaders on this webinar about leveraging data to support educational equity. Just to give you a little bit of introduction, here are our presenters today. So welcome to have Caroline Vander Ark, who's the chair of the Project Unicorn Steering Committee, Christopher Brown from Abington School District, Rebecca Kim from Kent School District in Washington, and Jenny Bradbury from Digital Promise. I'm Susan Bearden from InnovateEDU. I'm just going to be kicking us off today with a little bit of an introduction. Just a word for our attendees. If you have any questions for our panelists, we are going to have some time set aside for question and answer at the later in the webinar. So please feel free to add your questions to the question and answer. You should see at the bottom of your screen, or at the top of your screen, there's a little box that says Q&A. So please feel free to add your questions there during the webinar. And when we get to that point in the session, we'll give you an opportunity. We will answer those questions for you. So just to share a little bit about Project Unicorn, in case you're new to us, we are actually a coalition of 18 organizations in the education technology space that is working to support and promote the use of data interoperability in K-12 education. We recognize that collective problems require collective action in order to resolve them, and that's what the Project Unicorn Coalition is designed to do. And just to give a brief overview of interoperability, which, as you can see, is the official Project Unicorn definition there at the top of this screen. And our focus today is not on the technical aspects of interoperability, but it is on what interoperability can help make possible in terms of helping school systems leverage their educational data. And data interoperability is so important because states and districts are swimming in data they often can't really use. It's stored in siloed locations. It's difficult to bring those data sources together. Unvalidated data often leads to inaccuracies. And it's when you have folks who are exporting Excel spreadsheets of data, that's not the most secure method of transferring data in between systems. And of course, it's also very challenging for both educators and school staff and for students when they have to leave their learning management system, or if if educators are manually downloading data and manipulating it in spreadsheets. But data can be very powerful, as you're going to hear today. Here are the four data standards bodies that are active in the K-12 space. Each of them has different standards that apply to different use cases. And if you're interested in learning more about them, please check out the Project Unicorn YouTube channel. We have webinars from each of the standards bodies that are only about half an hour long that describe each of the standards and their use cases in more detail. Just a quick reminder before I turn things over to Caroline, just want to encourage you, if you have not done so already, to sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. We have both a school system and EdTech vendor pledges. The link on your screen is for the school system pledge, but if you go to projectunicorn.org, you'll see the link to the vendor pledge as well. Basically, when you sign the pledge, you're signaling to other school systems, EdTech vendors, and the broader school that you're committed to helping your students grow with interoperability, as the speakers on our webinar today are going to demonstrate. So now I'm going to turn things over to Caroline Vander Ark with Getting Smart. She is the chair of the Project Unicorn Steering Committee, and this year, equity is a major theme of the Project Unicorn's work. So Caroline, can you share a little bit more?
Of course. Thanks, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, I have the privilege of being the steering committee chair for this year. And this is actually the first year that we've had a steering committee chair. So it's a really exciting role, a nice chance for us to really think about our structure as a committee and how we can really think about focus areas that we want to dive into year by year. So this year, we are really thinking about the intersection of data equity and data interoperability, and really wanting to spend some time focusing on how data interoperability can make data equity possible. And so I'm excited for you to hear from these two district leaders today, and to hear what they're doing in terms of data equity. What we'd love to hear more from you is really thinking about what are the resources that would support your districts and your schools in doing this work, and how can we either create new resources or amplify existing resources at this intersection of data equity and data interoperability. So please provide us feedback. Let us know what you need after you hear from these leaders today. We just love that feedback about how we can continue to support your work. So thanks for joining today, and I will hand it to Jenny, who's going to walk us through the work of Digital Promise.
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, as you saw on that slide, Digital Promise is a member of the Project Unicorn Steering Committee, and we've had the good fortune to be able to work in the data interoperability space for about the past 6 years. And one of the things that we noticed over the course of that time in working with districts was that the overwhelming majority of use cases that they were trying to solve for through data interoperability had some connection to or foundation in equity. And so that led us over the last couple of years to really dive deep into understanding the relationship between data interoperability and data equity, and making sure that we were supporting districts in understanding those connections, and more importantly, in sort of moving their work forward in both of these areas. So on the screen, you see a definition of what data equity is in our view. It is not digital equity, which it's often confused with, which is about making sure that students have equitable access to devices and all of the necessary bandwidth, et cetera, to get online. We are firmly committed to that as well. But data equity is kind of twofold. One, it's about applying an equity lens to all of the ways in which we work with data. So it's thinking about how there are equity implications in what data we're collecting and who's doing the collecting and what instruments we're using to collect that data. There are also data equity questions and considerations all throughout the data life cycle. So it's, as we think about who's analyzing, interpreting, communicating, and making decisions with data, we want to encourage folks to really make that process inclusive and ensure that they are getting diverse views and voices and perspectives and experiences around the table, so that they can ensure that they're understanding fully the community that they're serving. Additionally, we believe that data equity is about then applying that mindset and using data to address historic and systematic inequities that often exist within school systems. And so you're going to hear just in a short while from two really wonderful school leaders who have sort of taken on this interconnection between data equity and data interoperability and come up with some very powerful solutions to address inequities that they saw in their systems. Here are just a few examples of positive practices for data equity. So I mentioned, that data collection is the beginning of the cycle, and we want to think about who's doing the data collection, making sure that we are collecting data from folks who are sometimes excluded from that process. We want to think about what data we're collecting and what data we're valuing. So right now, there's a lot of conversation about street data and the recognition that in order to have a full understanding of our students and their needs and their strengths, we need to be looking at both qualitative and quantitative data. And it's challenging when you're talking about interoperability to pull all of that data together in one place, but that really is an important problem for us to solve for, because it's very hard to understand the full student and their full experience within your school or district unless you're pulling on mixed method approaches. Data interpretation, we've seen really powerful examples of how making data interpretation an inclusive process can yield really unexpected insights. We have districts who are bringing students to the table to look at data and have conversations with them that are allowing them to really understand and sort of look more deeply into that data than they were doing when it was just adults sitting around the table having those conversations. And lastly, we need to think about how we're making data accessible to diverse audiences. We talk a lot in education about, wanting to make data actionable, but what that means for an administrator may look very different from what it means for a teacher or a parent or a student. And so there are lots of equity considerations at all of these different stages of the data cycle that we want to encourage folks to really think deeply about and commit to addressing through an equity mindset. When we sort of first started to look at the relationship between these two, I actually talked to a bunch of folks who I've been working with over the years and sort of asked them the question of, do you think data equity is possible without interoperability? And the answer was basically yes, but it's not practical. It takes so much time and effort and manual labor to really understand the root causes of a lot of the disproportionalities that folks are seeing in their data, that to then be able to have the energy and time to address those disproportionalities is really prohibitive. And so we believe that interoperability is a critical part of addressing inequities in systems because it allows you to see very clearly where those inequities exist, but it also allows you to start asking some important questions about why those inequities exist. And so we've seen districts like the ones you're going to hear from today, really make some profound changes in a short period of time in addressing some significant inequities when they were able to pull all of their data together into one single stream that people could then analyze in important ways. And here are just a few of the use cases that have sort of been central to the work that we've been supporting in districts over the last several years. But a lot of what we see districts trying to solve for are inequities related to disciplinary referrals, related to access to either higher level courses or referrals to special education and remedial courses. And so we were seeing the same types of challenges presenting across a lot of different districts. And so I'm excited to have Chris and Rebecca here today to share with you how they have gone about solving for some very common challenges that districts are experiencing. And this is my last slide before I turn this over, but we have, as part of our work, developed what we call our Data Ready Diagnostic and Playbook, which is a really comprehensive set of resources that's designed to help districts go from sort of an awareness of what data equity and interoperability are, all the way through the work of data governance, needs assessment, and project planning to get to a point where they have a really well-scoped, well-budgeted, well-planned project plan that they can then put into action. So we encourage folks to take a look at that. It's totally free, and there's a lot of great resources there for folks who are interested in pursuing this work, whether you're at the very beginning of your journey or, well into it. We also are in the process then of creating self-paced modules out of this content. And so those will be coming soon so that folks will be able to work through this content at their own pace. And after completing the content for each of the modules, we'll be able to submit the work that they've completed to earn micro-credentials in those areas of data governance, needs assessment, and project planning. And lastly, we are going to be running another cohort. So I met Chris and Rebecca actually through a previous cohort. Chris was a participant, Rebecca was a coach, and it was really a great pleasure to work with both of them alongside a bunch of other districts who are trying to move forward in their interoperability and equity journeys. So if you are from a district or you are working with districts, please know that we're going to have an opportunity coming this fall to run another cohort and support another group of districts in advancing this work. So without further ado, I am going to pass the mic to Chris, who's going to share the work that he and his team have been doing in Abington.
All right, thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. And as Jenny was mentioned, so our project, my goal today is to try to translate some of that into what it actually looks like in the school district. So, we did use the playbook and had great success with that. And our project was about increasing, equitable access through interoperability. And our focus was in the area of access to gifted and advanced courses. So to boil down our challenge, traditionally in our school district, the process to get into, an honors or an advanced placement course was based on a teacher recommendation. And for us, the challenge was, essentially we had open enrollment. We had an opportunities to learn initiative that would allow any students to take any course. And that was in place in our district for, at the time that this started, probably about 15-ish years. But the question was, if there's no barriers, if we've removed the barrier, how come kids still aren't going into the classes? So we were really looking at an advanced level of kind of analyzing and examining a problem. And what we came back to was, we didn't have an objective means of predicting that academic success. And I share that to say, in the course placement process, there was a lot of room for bias. And I mean that in a great number of ways. Think about recency bias. A student who may have had a rough couple of weeks in class leading up to a recommendation, a teacher may think, I'll put myself in that category. I was a teacher and I was subject to these same kind of thoughts, that student is not an honors student, despite the fact that the student may have had the ability to be successful in an honors class. So, what we wanted to do from a data standpoint was look at how can we create an objective way to really make that evaluation we have a number of different learning, software platforms that gather a lot of data. How can we get them to communicate so that we can come up with something that will, make this process more objective, but also more reliable and easier for the end user. So that's where we started and where we ended up, as far as a goal was looking at how do we create an algorithm to kind of get to the question of, does the student have the ability to be successful? So not a teacher thinking about, will the student be successful, but does the student have the ability to be successful? And to do that, we essentially took, in our first year with the cohort, we took a lot of data and kind of analyzed, how students who were placed in honors courses did. And from an objective standpoint, we also evaluated students who were not in honors places to see if, where we could identify students who should have or could have had an opportunity to be in those classes based solely on their academic potential. So based solely on, some of the more standardized measures, some of the more the unit placement tests and removing some of the more subjective measures. And that led us to our second goal, which was using the objective measures, as a basis for the course placement decision. And we're working in that area now. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But, the ultimate goal was more proportional representation in our course placements across the board. So what that looks like, and here's an example of kind of all the data that went in, was we were able to develop, and this is the end result of a lot of collaboration between our technology department, between our teaching and learning department, our school counselors, even our teachers have input. Everybody had input into kind of what the data sources were. And the screen cuts off here to the right, but what you can see is there's a lot of information, on beyond that, of different assessments, of different things that go into, essentially how students did and how they were placed. And essentially we put them in a couple of tiers. There were students who were qualified, meaning like they were in the top tier from an objective evaluation of their academic performance. And then there were students who were in consideration, meaning they were somewhere, in the middle tier, but they could have a push up. And in taking those two categories and looking at, in the first year, we looked at students who were placed in the courses who were in the qualified tier, but also students who were not placed in those courses who were in the qualified tier. And we were able to identify a large number of students who didn't have access to those courses, who we were able to push and recommend, for that opportunity, ultimately with the goal of how do we not miss them in the first place? So that was how, from what we learned in that first year, we kind of went back to the drawing board to say, like, how do we not miss them in the first place? So, as you look, as we continue to kind of build out like what it could look like, we started with the class of 2027, and grade 7. So like what the honors, placement actually looked like. So that's this middle category. So this is for English language arts in that school year, like this was the proportional breakdown of what it actually looked like. When we used our predictive algorithm, this bottom tier is what that same grade level looked like after, we use this as a baseline for the course placements. And you can see along the top, you see the proportion of students in these student groups. So this is just our student population as a whole. And along the bottom, like that's what the proportion would look like. So, if we did that in theory, like we should see more proportionality in terms of like the recommendations for those placements. So like what it actually looked like, as we look into kind of using that as a baseline, there was some improvement in terms of kind of getting more students access to these courses. Now, it wasn't a perfect execution of the plan. We learned a lot of things along the way, and we continue to refine that process. But we were able to, through all the different stakeholders and kind of interpreting and analyzing the data through this lens, make us some significant progress in our efforts. So, like as this continues, like you can see, like this school year, like we replicated that process. And, like I look specifically at our middle school because that's where our largest transition took place. It's the sort of the gateway into the courses, like as we grew. So that first year, we were kind of operating all year learning about this, and we made recommendations for the second year. This 22-23 school year was the second year. And, like we were able to do this much sooner in the year. So the next step was when we did this in November, we actually put that information, that baseline decision in the hands of our school leadership teams in November. So what they were able to do from November to December, and into the spring was they were able to then, work with the teachers to then from a growth, like an asset-based perspective, work with the students, hey, you've been identified as having the ability to be successful in this course. Here are some skills that you can work on. So rather than catching them after they slip through the cracks, the first message was, you have the potential to be successful. And that was very helpful because, the group was able to identify more students. And we're in the process of evaluating how that went. Obviously, those course placement decisions aren't finalized until after the summer. But, like all of that is coming through, paired with, as you can see in our most recent professional development day, we started to also pair that with, okay, when we put the students in these honors and advanced settings, how do we support them while they're there? Like creating that culture. And that's a whole separate, conversation for another session, but we're doing that work as well. And then next year, as you see into 23, 24, the more data we can add. So there was initially some teachers who were a little hesitant about kind of what data can add, what can be considered. Now they're more receptive to the idea. They're more willing to want to kind of engage and use the data. So they're thinking, maybe we can add this, maybe we can add this to get a better, more accurate picture. And then eventually the plan is to actually have more student and teacher ownership of the data. So doing this not just for that recommendation process, but like I mentioned, that growth mindset, using it instructionally to leverage growth, throughout the year. So it's not just a catch to make a recommendation, but it's ultimately, like the entire process. So that's where, our work really is continuing to go, and our experience with both the cohort and data equity. I'm going to transition now and introduce my colleague, Dr. Kim, who will take over from here.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you for sharing the important, inspiring work. I think that's something specific to our country. As we look at the proportionality or disproportionality of who's showing up in our courses. So thank you for that. My name is Rebecca Kim, and I am currently going through a transition after serving as a leader in various roles in Highline Public Schools, just south of Seattle, Washington. I will be moving over to another district next door as the incoming Associate Superintendent of Teaching and Learning. You know, regardless of what district I am representing or what district that I work in, I think that the important core value and work is around the way that we engage with, we look at, and we serve our students and communities with a strength and equity-based lens. And so regardless of where that space is, I think it is upon us to be committed to that work for all of our children across the country. So that being said, I do want to share that I come to you as a parent of 2 teenage kids, a teacher, previous school principal, and then a district leader for the last several years. And in all of those spaces in my personal and professional life, I'm driven by my core values around social and racial justice. And that shows up in the work that I have the privilege to lead. So what we want to share with you today is just a piece of what that might look like if we re-envision data and what that looks like in student and staff profiles that have a strength and equity-based lens. And, you know, I appreciate in the beginning the definition of data interoperability as being seamless. It is absolutely a journey that comes with a lot of complexity, a lot of challenges along the way, but it's the right work, and it's a multi-year journey. So next, what I want to share is that our journey in Highline has been centered around our promise to know staff and students, particularly around the profile, it's staff and students, but our promise in Highline for the last 10 years under the leadership of Dr. Susan Enfield, and then now living on the promise with Dr. Ivan Duran, is that every student in Highline Public Schools is known by name, strength, and need, and graduates prepared for the future they choose. Data interoperability shows up in the way that we are living on the promise and the resources and tools that we put in front of our stakeholders to ensure that those experiences are being realized. So in this work of building these profiles, which has been a multi-year journey, there are several different problems that we were trying to solve. I think this list could go on with, you know, across districts, across the country, that there's a lot of problems we're trying to solve. But in this case, specific to the work that we've been focusing on for the last several years, is to provide a fuller and richer picture so that we're looking at students, yes, based on the needs that we need to ensure that we are putting strategies and interventions in place, but also a way to celebrate the strengths. And to buy something off the shelf from vendors is not always going to be aligned to what questions we want to answer in these profiles and what data metrics that we want to bring in. So again, building a single data system with multiple resources to build that fuller picture that's holistic. We also want these profiles to not just look at a student by their state test score or their College Board score, but we also want to get to other root causes. And that's where the importance of data triangulation and the multiple metrics, which will be strengths and needs, are important for us to really get to root causes as we try to look at trends over time around disproportionality, for example. The list goes on here, but I think what's really important for data interoperability is when we think about the end users and data literacy of the end users, that we want to decrease the platform fatigue. We have multiple data-rich dashboards that come from the different applications we use, but to have to toggle back and forth to get a quick snapshot of their state test score, their benchmark scores, their social emotional learning, attendance. We recognize that that fatigue could make people lose interest or perhaps we know that time is always a priority and there's a lot on the plates of our educators. So platform fatigue causes us to think about different strategies and ways that we want to make sure we're building efficient tools. So again, going back to living on the promise of Highline, the vision of this work has been to build a holistic and strength-based data system. So this is not something that is specific to one department, but the importance and the intentionality of cross-collaboration over the course of the journey has been extremely important. I had the privilege to serve as a data equity coach with a few districts through the Digital Promise work that I've been participating in. And one of the things that I really highlighted and underscored is the importance of bringing stakeholders along the way. It may not all be at the same time. It may be for specific periods of time where you want to get to specific benchmarks, but just want to underscore the importance of the cross-departmental and team collaboration, and then also the importance of the ongoing leadership sponsorship. Without that sponsorship, that as one of the leads of this work that I have had from both superintendents that I've been working under, it's been extremely important to have that sponsorship to be able to continue to move the work forward. So I just want to name that for districts who might be listening and thinking that this is just something that a tech team would do or a data team would do, but it really takes everybody wrapping their arms around it. And with that being said, I just want to name that the really important work that's taken place is ensuring that the stakeholders are part of the process of developing the vision of what it means to be strength-based. So we spent about 1.5 years, 2 years with Design Lab 2 to ground ourselves around research about what it means to be strength-based. We centered some of our work around the research of Eve Tuck. She has this open letter that she writes called Suspending Damage. And it's out to educators and researchers, and it talks about the long-term impact of damage-centered research. And moving away from being damage-centered, which also often happens, or some may call it deficit-based, with our most marginalized communities, is being more desire-based and strength-based. So we used research like that to build co-constructed design principles of what we would want a strength-based student profile to look like. So what you see here is a simple one-pager. It's colorful. And what this doesn't show, though, is the amount of work and time that included central office and school-based stakeholders to build what they believe a strength-based profile would be. Talking about what questions we would want this to answer and what metrics would answer those questions. And so you see here, we put them in different categories by demographics to academics, social, emotional, and behavior, and then progress and pathways. And that's where the street data really comes in. Without talking to students and listening to them and asking them what their aspirations are around their other skills and interests and talents, we won't know, and we wouldn't be able to build that holistic picture. So we have this also for the staff profile, but today I'm just going to focus on the student profile. And of course, we will be updating this because this was built a couple of years ago, knowing the great impact of the pandemic, the increased need for mental health supports, the increased need for the academics. We recognize that this needs some updating, and we do have a celebration that some of this data that we thought we didn't yet have, we actually have been collecting it over the last couple of years. So this is just a sketch. So this is not a fully baked, but very soon will be pushed out in its first version in Highline. And that's super exciting. It has been, again, a multi-year journey of work. So what you see here simply for the elementary student profile, you see that growth and mastery is very intentionally the largest tile that you would see if you would click on the students. Now, this is a mock-up, so this is not actual student data. We know that attendance and behavior are important, high stakes data that must be collected, but we don't want that to be the first thing that users would see. Attendance and behavior, especially behavior, because when we look at discipline disproportionality, oftentimes we know that it's about biases that lead to students getting suspended or disciplined. And so we have attendance and behavior in there However, you don't see that as the biggest tile. And so there's just been real intentionality about the graphic design to ensure that when users are looking at this specific student, that they're seeing all of the different ways that we can look at a student by their strengths. Let's celebrate the growth that they've made over time. While they may not be proficient by the end of the school year, we can celebrate that there's been reading growth by the benchmark assessment that is currently being used in Highline. We also see the demography. That's data that we usually collect for enrollment. And then interests. That's data we don't yet have, but that's data that we are interested in collecting. And that's where that data interoperability really comes in. What would be the collection method? How do we ensure it's following the standard? Jenny previously showed 4 standards. How do we ensure that we are following the same standard so it can all live in that same space? So just a lot of technical things, but most importantly, it's using that strength-based lens to ensure that we are really thinking about how to look at a student holistically. So social emotional learning, we just launched in the winter in Highline a student-driven cell screener for our intermediate grade level and secondary students. And that's data that we're excited that we're going to be able to start building in. So at the middle school level, you see that the metrics change. We now have their current courses that they are enrolled in. We have their current grade, and then we have other similar demographics. So we had school leadership give perspectives on what would be the important holistic data that we would want to live here. What you see on the left side is where the data interoperability comes in. We don't want this to be all the data that lives in our benchmark assessments. We're not trying to replace the dashboards that already exist with the current applications. What metrics from iReady that are used as the reading and math benchmark assessments, what specific metrics would we want to pull into the new ODS? And that's where we would identify those metrics with that student profile work group. We have a state portal that gives us the data on their state assessments and their language proficiency assessments. We would pull only specific metrics in there. And then you see the list goes on by the screener that we use for social emotional learning, for our student information system, and then survey and other data collection methods are yet to be determined. But that is to ensure that they all live in the same space. And then for high school, the last snapshot here just shows that we're now looking at, we want to be looking at it throughout the journey, but the data that we know that deans and counselors and advisors are looking at are their credit progress, their GPA, to ensure that they're on the right track towards graduation. So you'll see that there's a bit of a variance from the elementary, middle, and high school level, staying true to the core value around being strength and equity based. The last thing I just want to share for a couple of use cases is something important that we need to think about that we're still trying to work on is the security permissions and who has access to this. We have shown this sketch and the vision to some community partners. So community partners that have access to our student data, it would be important that they have access throughout the year instead of getting data at the end of the year when we know it's lagging. Staying in the moment to ensure that in the moment supports are available. And then of course to our staff and then parents need to think about, once this is all living in one space, the importance of security permissions. So with that, I will pass it off to Jenny for, I think, a couple of questions.
Great,
I went
thank you.
over my time. I told you I might do that.
Not at all. So thank you so much, Chris and Rebecca, for sharing your stories and the work that you've been doing. I love that in both cases, it's really about lifting up the strengths of your students and making sure that they're not getting lost in the data, but that the data is serving them and their needs. So Yes, as Susan put in the chat, we encourage all of you who are here, participants, to please use the Q&A or use the chat to let us know if you have questions for our panelists. But I will go ahead and get started. You both talked about this as a journey and as, a multi-year endeavor. And you both talked about the need to kind of pull in a lot of stakeholders. I'm curious if you could go back and share with your sort of younger, more naive self, some of the tips and tricks you've learned along the way. What are the things you wish you knew then that you know now about this journey?
I think one of the things for us that I think became more clear over time was it was very important to have those folks, like the different stakeholder groups in the conversation. So for us, it started as, a small mix of, our teaching and learning department. It started with our technology team. It started with, some of our central administrators, and it trickled out to the building level administration. But, I think what has really accelerated this second year was how valuable it was bringing counselors into the discussion early, bringing teachers into the discussion, getting the feedback to make the necessary improvements to what it is that we were doing in practical ways. So for us, I think, like hindsight is trust the folks who have the real level, like everyday experience in the conversation sooner because all that input is valuable.
I could talk about all the lessons learned or what I would tell my younger self. You see all my white hairs I have here. It's a lot of stress. So I would say on the technical side of things, it costs money to do this when I'm talking specifically about the profile work. And we were afforded a generous grant through a local foundation, nationally known foundation too. And the work that I did to understand and learn what data interoperability is I kind of partially joined this cohort that was available to Digital Promise. I am not a technology person by training. So the term that I often use is I was a wannabe fly on the wall trying to learn what is data interoperability? What's the EdFi standard? How do you know which vendor to go with? And while I wish I would have known back then which vendor specializes in what and what the business model is, timelines, deliverables, all those things, those have been complex challenges along the way. But those have made us stronger as a team to know what it is that we're looking for. How do we shape this? If we were to inform and work with other districts to share our journey more explicitly, I think that those are bringing strengths. So while they were challenges and lessons learned, I don't know if there's any guide or playbook of how to do this exactly. I know there's a data equity playbook, but what I'm saying is just, there's not a guidebook of how to make sure this statement of work meets this deliverable by this time, et cetera. So just a lot of technical challenges, but I think it's been the right challenges to make us stronger. And then the last thing I'll share about that is I'm proud of the work that the team's been able to accomplish because we kept going throughout the pandemic inside our homes during quarantine to keep this work going.
Great. Thank you both for sharing that. And yes, we do have a data ready playbook, but it does not have the answers to, how to do this because this is so customized. It's so context specific. And so the data ready playbook is really designed to help you understand kind of how to engage the right folks and how to ask the right questions, but there is clearly no one size fits all solution. And, it really is in figuring out what questions you want to answer and having those rich conversations that I think a lot of the work around centering and equity happens. So I really appreciate that. We do have a couple of questions. So we have a question for you, Rebecca, about the dashboards that you showed. It says, I understand that the student portal pulls info from multiple apps, databases, programs to house the most pertinent student data in one place. Where do staff log in to see this student profile?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. At the beginning, I shared that it's not fully baked yet, so there isn't direct access yet. We do have a district dashboard that is housed internally, and so it would likely live there because that would follow all of our data governance and permissions, et cetera. So eventually with training, good data literacy training to ensure that end users use the data in thoughtful ways, that those are in place, it would be made accessible in that same format.
Great, thank you. We also have a question in the chat about how to engage family in this work. So the question specifically is, does family setting circumstances play a part in data equity? Assuming so, what are efforts to try to bring the family angle in data equity?
I could take a stab. When I'm thinking about that profile, or just even outside of that profile, listening to the families, that is data. That is qualitative data. That is street data. And specifically listening to families you don't typically hear from. That's the important equity-centered way in which I have learned that street data should be centered around. When we think about this, specifically the profile of data we don't yet have on questions we want to answer, specifically around students' talents, skills, and interests, that is where there's opportunity for students and families to have agency to be able to share their perspectives and what they would want the school to know. We've seen that done in the old school version. When you start a preschooler or kindergartner, what would you like to know? What would you like me to know about your child? And we fill it in and the kid turns it in and they get like a point for it or something. This is kind of a more innovative way that we might be able to do that, so that that kind of data would follow a student throughout their education journey in that district, or it would, for a secondary student, not just one teacher will know that they're good at a certain musical instrument because they had a conversation, but everybody would know because the student and the family had agency to share that.
And in our circumstance, I have a two-part answer. So the first is we actually encouraged our teachers and our staff, like once the course placements, as that process was moving on, like for any student who, let's say, for example, based on the objective evaluation, maybe didn't meet the criteria that they wanted to recommend for a push up, that they were allowed to do that. So that would incorporate some of the narrative feedback some of the information that they know about a particular student. For example, like had potential, but, a circumstance, a challenge may have arose and, progress was derailed, et cetera. So that we created opportunities for that information to come into that. But likewise, we also started in this year, and we'll do more so next year, using what we've created to engage families earlier, because there are a lot of families. In our cases, we were, gathering some information prior to the cohort who didn't even know what the process was, to have a child in an honors or an AP course in the first place. So using the information sooner, now the teachers are equipped with the data and the evidence to say, based on the performance, we'd like to recommend, like your student has the ability to be successful in these courses. So it's getting that information to them sooner so that they can act on it, so that they can make the push.
Yeah, and I can share another example from another one of our League of Innovative Schools districts, which is Compton Unified. They are doing some early work with families of English language learners, so that when they're seeing in their data that a student is potentially falling behind in a course, they're engaging those families in early conversations about how the school and the family can partner to provide the necessary support so that those students can thrive and succeed in those courses. And so that's just another example of how families are being engaged in this work to make data accessible and use it to address equity concerns. Any other questions? I see we have a few more minutes left, and so I want to encourage folks to let us know if you have any other questions for this group of folks. I will ask another question then, because Rebecca, you sort of spoke to this a little bit, talking about needing to develop data literacy within the district, that interoperability is one piece of the solution, but that interoperability alone is not going to get you where you want to be, right? And so you need to also build kind of an asset-based data literate culture. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you about, what that has looked like in your district.
So a couple of years ago, and this is ESSER funded, we were able to hire data literacy specialists. And they've done the work of helping to ensure that schools have not just the data metrics to progress monitor their annual action plan goals, but that they also would have supports to be able to do something with the data, the now what. I working with them, and then also just happened to be my doctoral research was focused on building and fostering data literacy in K-12 public education systems. And my big takeaway there was that, yes, there are many definitions of what data literacy is, but the importance of building together what data literacy means in your context, and then the knowledge and skills that you build around what that vision and purpose of data is, has been a really key learning for me. And so the action research that I engage in was asking school leaders and district leaders, what are the barriers that get in the way of moving data from the principal's office to the teachers? What are the ways or the frequency of teachers using data, and do they see the benefit? And if they have a desire to build knowledge and skills, in what format would it be most engaging to be able to gain some professional learning around that? So we built a framework around data literacy that's yet to be out there and published, but it was the voices and the input and the research and the context of the specific district that really drove what that data literacy looks like. I think we can often jump to a book or maybe a webinar like this, but it really needs to be all of the above to really do the learning and to build what that means so that it's meaningful to the people that we're asking to do the now what with the data.
Now, I will add to that notion of all of the above, because one of the resources that we found to be particularly useful was actually the book that we started with in the cohort. So the Solving Disproportionality and Achieving Equity by Eddie Fergus. As you can see by my multiple colorful tabs here, we really went to town on that. And we started in the cohort using that. But our team, found so much value in the extra, just a small excerpt that we used, that we actually went through that with the entire district leadership team. And we built the capacity for the team to really go through the exercises and really use the data, but then also to apply that to other areas within our district and see the translation between, okay, this is some of the theory and some of the action in the book, but also connect that then to our a great many projects, not just what we talked about today with our course placements, but looking at that, across the board. So, I completely second the notion of like all of the above, because, that journey to data literacy it's ongoing.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I had actually kind of forgotten about that was where we started that cohort with that book, but it is a great resource. And the very first chapters of the Data Ready Playbook really are provide a lot of resources for folks to do data equity walks and really think about and understand, what data are you using within your district and how is that being used? And is it being used in a way that is designed to support the needs and the strengths of all students. And I think, all of the folks in the cohort who did that work learned a lot. And I think you've sort of both spoken to the fact that really this is a learning journey that needs to be undertaken by committed teams. And so I'm so glad that you all were both in places where, you have those committed groups of colleagues who were able to participate in this journey with you. I do think too, to Rebecca's point, that it is work that requires cross-functional teams, right? Because people bring really different lenses to the work. And one of our learnings from doing this work, we started the first year we ran a cohort, we just wanted to have the chief technology officers be sort of leading the teams. And we discovered that if you really want to address these, it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, but if you really want to address these equity challenges, you need to have those academic leaders at the table. You need to have your chief equity officers at the table, and you need to then be bringing in the voices of families and students and teachers, that everybody can really help to contribute to understanding what data is most valuable and what questions you all need to answer together to be able to better support the needs of your students, which is really what it's all about at the end of the day. So thank you both so much for being here. Thank you, Susan and Project Unicorn and Caroline, for partnering with us and making this opportunity available. Thanks to our participants for joining us. As Susan said, we will be sharing the deck afterwards. We will also be sharing a recording. So hopefully you are all walking away from this conversation today with a little bit more knowledge and passion for this work. We appreciate you being here.